Hello, and welcome to the IAPR Podcast. Today, my guest is Christopher Silver. He's an assistant professor of psychology at Swanee, the University of the South. His research has covered a range of topics within the psychology of religion, including non-religious identity, developmental spirituality, deconversion, faith development, spiritual resilience, and more recently, spirituality across the lifespan. Beyond that, he's also conducted work in metapsychology, helping ensure that the psychology of religion stays at the forefront of science regarding the methods that it uses. So with that, welcome, Chris.
Thanks. I'm really glad to be here.
Firstly, I do want to lay my cards on the table. You and I have known one another for quite a few years now. I think we first spoke in 2019 through a mutual colleague who has unfortunately since passed.
Right.
The late great Tommy Coleman III.
Tommy Coleman. Yep, he's my guy. So
yeah. And for those who weren't able to attend the IAPR 2025 in Birmingham, there was an in memoriam session for people who had passed over recent years, and Tommy's name was brought up at the time, given that he was a great contributor as part of the IAPR, especially in his early career research. So today, I'd like to talk to you about a few things. Firstly, and I think something that is important for people who don't know about your work is to understand your academic background and then how you came to be in the psychology of religion. So if you could just expound on that a little bit.
I think, like most scholars, I suffer from a little bit of imposter syndrome. and so what that's, I think it's done a couple things. One is that imposter syndrome has probably driven my need to kind of prove myself a little bit. And I'm not saying that in any kind of arrogant fashion. It's more a matter of like, when I give you my education background, you're going to go, wow. So like, I have 2 bachelor's, 2 master's degrees, and 2 doctorate degrees. So I was in school for a minute. I got a bachelor's of science in psychology, a bachelor of arts in religious studies. I've got a master's of science where I worked with the great Ralph Hood in research psychology. And then I did 2 years at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, in religion and culture. And then I came back and got a doctorate in educational doctorate, learning and leadership, because I'm very interested in pedagogy. Actually, that's one of the things that a lot of my psycho-religion colleagues don't know, but I very much am interested in curriculum design and particularly around things like the scientific method and then also how we study religion, which is interesting enough. One of the things I teach here at Swanee. And then, of course, I've got a PhD in research psychology with an emphasis in social psychology from the University of Tennessee, which is in Knoxville, but it's the flagship school for Tennessee. So I was in school for a while. And so I've trained in a couple different areas, like individual differences, social psychology, including some experimental psych. I'm really kind of a jack of all trades researcher. I'm very multidisciplinary. So I really believe in, it's like what Hood calls methodological agnosticism, which is this idea that like we need to lead with the research question and then find the correct tools to address the research question. That's so important. And so I know sometimes in science, particularly when we get a very specific specialization in research, sometimes we have an emphasis to kind of really rely on the tools that we know the best. And sometimes, may dabble, but not really fully go in depth in those tools, And so that's generally been my background. I've been in the professor role full time now for, probably about 7 or 8 years. I actually went back to my alma mater, which was UT Chattanooga, and taught there in a doctorate program for a number of years on tenure track. But the problem was that while the program was nice, the problem was that I was kind of the token methodologist because I'm a qualitative researcher as well as quantitative. So I was on something like 20 different dissertations, which was a lot. And it makes it really difficult to do your own research sometimes. Of course, I've worked with Ralph for years, but I've also worked, and I need to go shout out to him because he's also been very instrumental in my career, was Heinz Stribe at the University of Bielefeld. So Heinz and Ralph both, and also Barbara Keller, have all kind of been they've been along for my educational journey for literally my entire career. The thing that's actually impressive about that research was we've had a long-standing collaboration for something like 25 years, right? And doing both mixed methods design work, sort of between subjects, but also some longitudinal stuff, which is super, super fun to do. when we talk about, religious change and faith. And so I got to give them a shout out, because I wouldn't be sitting on this podcast right now if it wasn't for them. But also, when I went down the social psych route too, my old advisor, Mike Olson, who did a lot of prejudice research, was willing to sign on to do religious prejudice research with me, which was kind of cool. And I'm also very, as you mentioned, I'm really big into sort of identity and group dynamics and that kind of thing. So I've had a very interesting career. I even had a stint in corporate America in IT for a while, which was wild. But the two things I'm very passionate about is mixed methods, interdisciplinary collaboration, including international collaboration, as you know, Sarah. And then at the same time, I'm also very much interested in pedagogy and like how we train future students to go on and be academics, and really try to ingrain in them the importance of working with others and collaborating with people who maybe are reading different things than you are and pushing you to be better, right? I will openly say, like, I'm not a top researcher in the field of psychology of religion, and that's okay. I look at it as my worldview is to help lift others up, and I like to be supportive and help colleagues, particularly my international colleagues. And I really enjoy collaboration. I really enjoy learning from others, and so I've been incredibly lucky that I've gotten to do that. So
I wanted to point out something you mentioned. You were talking about your love of pedagogy and working collaboratively. That is something that I've always really admired about you, and something that is very noticeable. Every time you come to the IAPR conferences, you bring with you this group of young, really, really excited young researchers, many of them doing undergraduate work or master's work.
Yes.
And you're able to not just give them the opportunity to present, posters or give 5-minute, 10-minute presentation talks at the conferences, but you provide them this incredible opportunity to understand the diversity that exists within research. Because as young students, undergraduate students, master students, it's very easy to have a preconceived notion of what academia looks like from the outside. It's so easy to go, oh, well, this is scary, this is terrifying. And I know that some of your students, I'm the kind of person who asks a lot of questions when it comes to the conferences, and some of your students saw me asking these questions and they were petrified. But then when I asked them questions about their work and they were able to answer, they suddenly like, oh, I now understand why you're asking those questions. And I actually feel it made them feel more confident, not less. It made them feel built up rather than pulled down. And it was really great to see how well you had instilled a fantastic understanding of the scientific method, but also just a strong foundation and positivity about research that you would manage to bring out in them. And this isn't just a one-off. You do this in every student that I've seen you bring. And it really is, I think, a special skill. And so while you say to yourself, and as you say, we all have imposter syndrome, and while you say self-demean and say that you're not one of the top tier researchers in the psychology of religion, I think that you have a skill that is actually incredibly rare in academia, and that is the ability to inspire the next generation to be doing good research and to really be excited about doing good research. And you have this uncanny ability to bring that out in almost anyone I see you talk with, which is fantastic.
No, and I'm lucky because I end up getting to meet really brilliant students. So, like, for example, you brought up the late Tommy Coleman, who I became incredibly close to. Tommy started out as my student initially. So I know a lot of people associate Tommy with Ralph, but interestingly enough, Tommy and I started working together first, and then I introduced Tommy to Ralph, which was great. And Tommy went on to like just kill it. I mean, just prolific, an amazing theorist, by the way, right? And so, so Tommy's a great example. Cameron Mackey's a great example, who worked with Kim Rios and is, now has his PhD and has been publishing some really, really fascinating, interesting stuff, particularly around cultural tension and secularity, which has been amazing. I've got a student right now who's at UT Chattanooga. I'm still associated faculty over there, who is Matthew Shaven, who actually was at IAPR this year, and he's doing really, really cool research with Raveki out of Toronto on authenticity. And so I'm really lucky that so the one time I won't self-deprecate, I think I'm really good at talent recognition. I think I'm really good at seeing the potential in students. But honestly, Sarah, it's kind of selfish because, I feed off their passion for it, and I get excited when they're excited about new ideas. And, like I've got a theologian I'm working with right now here, and I'll talk a little bit about our future research here in a bit. And this is only a smattering. I've got more students who've gone on and done stuff. And what's fascinating, Sarah, I'll give you a compliment, was when you came up and talked to my students. From that conversation, you gave them the self-confidence that at least 2 of them are now applying for doctorate programs, which is amazing, right? So, and again, I'm lucky that I'm at an institution. Swanee's an incredibly strong. It's a small liberal arts college in Tennessee, but we actually have if you know us, we have an incredibly great reputation for academic rigor. A lot of our alumni go on to do really big things, and particularly in our psych department, a lot of our students are very well prepared, and most of them go to grad school, go on and do really cool stuff. So I've been very lucky to get this job here because it gives me access to such brilliant students. And I'm glad you talked about that because I think it's so important. Yeah, I enjoy being someone who can be a guide, and there's nothing greater. This sounds very corporate, but there's nothing greater than when your student outgrows you. It's the best feeling ever, right? It always has tons of return. Like I get a lot of benefit out of that too, because I get to see them go on and do big and great things, and I got like, wow, I got to be a part of that journey, even though they earned it, but I'm glad I got to be a part of that journey. So
I couldn't agree more. Some of my proudest moments are seeing some of my students excel when they weren't sure that they could do something, and then you
yes.
get them to a place where not only can they do it, but they do it excellently, and that
Yes.
feels like some of the most satisfying things that you can do in life, seeing other people succeed because you helped get them there, not because they couldn't have done it without you, but because they already could do it and you showed them that they could.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what it's all about. And let me give a shout out to IAPR, because one of the things I love about IAPR particularly, and there's 1,000 things I love about IAPR, but one of the things I really love about it is how many of our colleagues like yourself do go up and talk to students, introduce themselves. I remember a couple of my students were talking about how excited they were that they got to talk to Dr. Sargalo, they got to talk to, Daryl Van Tongeren, Robert Airwood, Kevin Ladd. I mean, so it's also fun that they get to make some of these connections on their own too. And IAPR is such a supportive organization. I'm not even I'm not even kidding when I say this. Of all the organizations I'm a part of and the ones I participate in, IAPR is the conference I look forward to every 2 years. It is the paramount conference for me. So if you've never been to it, it's for the listeners. If y'all have never been to an IAPR conference, try to find a way to go. It will legitimately change your life. It's incredible.
Yeah, I know this is quite self-serving given I'm the host of the IAPR podcast, but
right.
I agree. I've been to many conferences as an academic. I've been to ones across, because I'm not only in the psychology of religion, I'm in kind of psychobiology as well, and also social psych. So I've been to social identity conferences. I've been to neuroscience conferences. I've been to all sorts. And the IAPR is the one that I always leave regretting that I have to leave, if that makes sense.
Yes.
The other ones I'm like, oh, that was a lot, but it was nice to be there, but that was a lot. IAPR, I was like, kind of wish there was one more day, just because everyone there, as you mentioned, is so open to hearing things from other perspectives. There's a lot of this, in my opinion, ideal approach to wanting to be multidisciplinary, like you mentioned, wanting to work with people from other sides of the world, wanting to work across different, I guess, levels of experience, where you have some of the people who are professors, like Kevin Ladd, as you mentioned, who are more than happy to talk to people who are doing their PhDs or even who are doing their master's degrees, and that, discussing the new ideas that are coming up, because you don't know what you don't know. And so the only way to find out new information is by talking to everyone, including the new generation of researchers. And people at IAPR really, really are open and receptive to that, which I love.
Yeah. And excuse me, the other thing that's also interesting too, it's like, not only do you have all these people kind of converge in one place, and all their various research interests and things like that. But you also get it through the international lens of like, what are people reading, right? Like I was literally just talking to Tatiana Schnell the other day, and like it's fascinating, like when I talk to her and like what she's reading, and what her hot button is and what she's really interested in for research. So I love that, and how our colleagues all do research in different ways. It's like multiple paths up the mountain, to use a good Buddhist analogy. It's we're all going towards the common goal here, and we're doing it through a variety of ways. And like I tell y'all, if any of you ever go to our next conference, which is in Brazil, like talk to our colleagues from Turkey. They're doing really fascinating stuff right now. Turkey is probably going to be one of the, if it's not already, the next big sort of hot spot for psych of religion research. And what I love about our Turkish colleagues is, kind and as nice as they are, they're also flipping some of our conclusions in the West on its head a little bit, and I love it. Let's lean into this. I'm all about it.
Absolutely. Speaking of, actually, I have been discussing potential podcast interviewee subjects for the future for people from Turkey. There is a PhD student who presented at IAPR 2025 who was recently graduated from their PhD, I believe, but they were still doing their PhD in 2025. So that could be an exciting prospect. And I want to hear more about the work that's coming out of Turkey, because it is really good work, as you mentioned. And the fact that the next IAPR conference in 2027, which is in about 18 months, summer in the Northern Hemisphere, it will be winter in the Southern Hemisphere, but it's in Brasilia, so it's fairly equatorial, and therefore, seasonally speaking, it should be nice and warm still in Brasilia. So that should be really, really exciting come summer 2027. But back to your research. So I could talk about this tangent all day. But I do want to ask you things that only you know, or things that we can only learn about you. So it's stuff that you've done in the past. So you've done a lot of work on religious self-identity. And so in the psychology of religion, there's a lot of work that uses labels like religion and spirituality, and they often label that as R/S measures, that kind of thing.
Yes.
But in some of your work, especially, for example, like the self-identification work that you did in Germany at the early part of the 2010s, with Keller, I believe, and colleagues, you distinguished between religious and spiritual quite explicitly. These were different things. So can you explain, one, how you distinguish between the two, and why? What was the planned approach on that?
Yeah. So a lot of this has its origins actually in the States with Zenbaum Pargament, who had done quite a bit of work on trying to figure out like what is sort of this discrete variable between being religious, being spiritual, both and neither. And so we and our team, Strive colleagues, really kind of leaned into some of that. Particularly, we've got a whole volume on spirituality that we published that we're really trying to parse that out a little bit about like, what does this mean to be religious or spiritual? But it really seems is the case, and I'm really simplifying an incredibly complex construct here. So like the executive summary, I guess, is that people are having these experiences, right? I think it's like what Nico Coles calls like exceptional experiences, right? But people are having these experiences. But what's fascinating is that these experiences are special, right? So qualitatively, there's something about them that sets them aside from, not to go into sacred profane kind of language, but something that sets it aside from sort of the profane nature of just everyday existence and the everyday experience of being human. And so what's particularly interesting about this area is that some people are having those experiences sort of at the individual level through their own sort of individual interpretive lens. And then some people are having these experiences through the interpretive lens of a particular belief system and or theological system, right? And I think that's sort of where our research is particularly interesting, is that we see some of that. We see some of that like individualized, where it's like another colleague of mine once said, well, they were commenting on some stuff that we had written. They were like, it seems like, spirituality is kind of like Baskin and Robbins ice cream, right? Like there's a lot of different flavors of what people bring together to make this thing called spirituality, this ice cream they call spirituality, right? Where if in a religious context, maybe you're still having ice cream, but you're limited to very specific types of ice cream. So, maybe pistachio or chocolate is it, and that's fine. It's still ice cream, right? You still enjoy it. It still brings meaning to your life. And then the other piece that we've dug into a little bit and this is more Constantine Klein and Scribe and some of them, is also some of the secularity stuff, which I also have done research with Tommy and others. And then there's also been a number, like Van Tongeren's got his religious duns, and then you've got Sargelo's got some really, really cool stuff. So everybody's doing some secularity stuff. And so there's also this like, well, what happens if people don't identify as having, being spiritual or religious? And this is also kind of an interesting debate for me a little bit, and the literature has been addressing this too. I think John Jong even wrote some pretty interesting treatise on this as well. It's like, is secularity also in of itself special? So to sort of cite a religious studies scholar, Russell McCutcheon, who talked about the sort of sui generis. I'm terrible with Latin, but anyways, this idea of like religion having its own specialness for its own sake. We see that thesis kind of playing out a little bit with secularity too. Is secularity, special for its own sake? And one of the things that I find fascinating is that I think it really depends. And we had a colleague who actually came up to us after our talk at IAPR, and they were from sort of Scandinavian countries, was like, well, this isn't really, secularity is not that big a deal for us. But, and you know what, they're 100% right. I think going back to Cameron's work, I think what is fascinating is when there's a cultural tension for which belief systems become culturally normative to that society, I think that's when secularity is potentially fascinating. But then the thing I've been wrestling with the past few months is like, but what happens if secularity isn't religious identity, even secularity, isn't that big a deal, right? How do we address that, right? Because even in mine and Tommy's a topology that we developed, and I'm still on the fence about if I still agree with my own work, which is kind of funny, because you know how it is, you re-examine things through a new lens and you start questioning even your own research, right? One of the things I've been thinking about is like how some of those types, and actually I should give a shout out to Robert Airwood's undergrad student, actually he'd even highlighted this, and that is this idea that like, is the emotional valence piece of feeling like, you're the other. Does that play a role in some of that, right? So the passion for secularity, is that also baked in with that otherness, that feeling of otherness and feeling like you're part of an out group, right? And I think there is something to be said about that. And so I think as we continue to sort of think through sort of Steve Bruce's idea that we're moving towards secular society, which I know some of our colleagues will say that's not true. Look at the US right now, right? But if we buy into that thesis, I think it is interesting to try to understand some of the complexity. And maybe it's nothing more than just various sort of expressions of personality manifesting in secular identity. Maybe that's all it is. Just different kinds of people are now embracing it. So we're seeing greater variability in identity. And so I really love that there, since we originally published, there's been this surge of research on secularity. And honestly, there's been some really good stuff that's light years beyond anything that I could have thought of, but I love that it's happening. And, I love that we can all be in dialogue about these things and even disagree on some of the theories and sort of how the variables operate. But at the same time, to me, it's the goal orientation of doing science and like what the outcomes are and working together and holding each other accountable, right? We're in a very tricky time right now. And so science has got to be sharp. We can't be lazy with science. And I think that's really important that we really lean into that.
That reminds me about saying that there's a lot of work being done on non-belief. Like there's the non-belief project that was happening throughout the late 2010s, and then the follow-on that was presented at, I think, in part in the 2023 IAPR. Stuff that's happening, researchers across Europe that are doing that. People in the UK, I know people like Valerie Van Malukum is working on it, but also there's people in the Nordic countries that are very much working on it, because as you said, and you kind of preempted one of my questions, is to ask you about the cultural, the cross-cultural differentiation and how that self-identification can change based on the salience of religion in a culture and which type of religion is salient in a culture. And a lot of your work, you will say it more than anyone, as I well know, you always say that your work is very WEIRD-centric. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons that I think some of the work coming out of Turkey, for example, right now is really interesting, because
so important.
They're looking at an Islamic majority country.
Yes.
Compared to a Christian majority country like America. Mm-hmm. And it's also to me, Turkey's, I think, fascinating because of its history, because Ataturk was very much supposed to be like an atheistic approach. He had a very atheistic approach to life. But more recently, in the last 20 years, the prominence of Islam has grown quite a lot in Turkish society. And so is there a difference between younger Turks and older Turks, for example, or
Right.
is all of that? These are interesting questions that are likely to be explored by people who are doing the research in Turkey. And it's one of the reasons that I think making sure that the IAPR highlights the voices from non-Western, non-global North countries is really, really important.
And it's also interesting because you think about it, you and I both, I should say for the most part, you and I both are in countries for which there is an open market on belief, meaning that like there's not necessarily a state instituted religion within those contexts. And so like there's some research going on in Pakistan right now that's actually looking at atheists in Pakistan. But see, the problem with being an atheist in Pakistan is you got to be very underground. So it means like you really got to build rapport. You've got to really build the trust with participants. There's all kinds of challenges and ethical issues. I'm really impressed with the research that these colleagues are doing in Pakistan, but I still think that's important. And also just like studying religion in, say, China would be important. So a lot of those cultural tension pieces sometimes add an interesting variable to the work that our colleagues in these countries are doing. And I also think it opens up some interesting cross-cultural comparison opportunities for us in the global north, right? That we can potentially compare and contrast. The word of warning I, of course, would give, and I'm sure you would too, Sarah, is that we've also got to make sure that we're approaching the literature and the research and the tools our colleagues use in these countries with very much an open mind, with the idea of we want to learn from them, right? I'm really, really big on, like when I do these cross-cultural collaborations, we'll try to lean into like, teach me the way you all, and then again, it's a bit selfish because I get to come back with a new tool set, right? Which is amazing. And it's not to say, we actually wrote a paper about this years ago, Dr. Keller and I did, like talking about like sometimes there's still some negotiation about different researcher styles and how do you collect data and what do you see as methodological rigor and what are the particular theories you're reading versus the theories I'm reading. And I know is through my own biases, and one of the things I've run into over time is that I assume everyone's read this thing that's really popular in the United States, and they may not have, right? And so sharing information and sharing resources, by the way, is also another big win too. And the cool thing is even trying to navigate cultural differences among the researchers, it's still so rewarding. It's such rewarding work. It just so is.
I could not agree more. And I'm lucky enough to currently be on a project where the two leads are an anthropologist and a sociologist. So there's a sociologist of religion and an anthropologist of religion. And I'm the only kind of psychologist on the project. So I'm the only person who's got any real experience with quantitative methods whatsoever. Everyone else is pure qual, like entirely qual. And so as a result, I'm learning a heck of a lot. Even my background is very quant heavy. Like I mentioned, I've got a kind of a biological sciences, neuroscience-y, psychobiology background. And so even though I have done mixed methods work, most of my experience is in the quant area. And so when I'm hearing all about all of the ethnographies that these people are doing and the kinds of approaches that they're doing, the kinds of questions that they even ask, these are so interesting to me. And it's also really interesting is that they've brought me in to help them have what they view as methodological rigor in because they know I've got a strong methods background, but also to have the quant side of things. But they're asking questions. I'm like, how do you even do the stuff that I know about in that way? Because of the questions that they're asking, right? And that's it's a challenge, which is great. When you're being challenged, that's when you know you're likely to do better work because it makes you think hard. It makes you really, really challenge yourself, and then you grow as a researcher.
Yeah, no, 100%. And so right now, one of the big projects that I'm hoping to undertake soon is I have a research fellowship at Wrexham University in the UK, working with Mandy Robbins. And by the way, I should definitely give a shout out to Mandy because Mandy and I have also known each other for a number of years. So one of the things that we've also been looking at is like resilience among first responders, and like how does religion play a role in that. And so we're currently in the currently in the process of sort of scoping out a potential international project. We're going to compare the United States and the UK, where they're two very different, distinct systems of how like police, fire, and EMS operate, right? So of course you all have the sort of socialized side. We've got the privatized side on the EMS side. You all have, was it police by consent? I think is the correct term, right? Or community policing, right? And then we've got, we obviously have institutionalized policing. So there's some interesting cultural differences, and some things are baked in both cases that'd be kind of fascinating, right?
Yes,
And
so there is also differences because the UK is kind of four countries in a trench coat, is how I like to describe it.
That's great.
And so it's not, even, for example, even in London, you have the Metropolitan Police, and
Right.
that's quite an institutionalized police force. Whereas in outside of London, you do have kind of institutionalized police, but the police by consent is far more of a thing outside of London, which is this metropolitan kind of, I guess like mega city, and as a
Right.
result has far more of that institutionalized police force.
Right. Yeah. So that's something that we're currently playing with now, and looking at like potentially almost like through a terror management lens. Like, they're seeing, a lot of these folks are seeing death and dying on a regular basis. And and it's also got a bit of a clinical component of like, how do they cope with these things? And then are there particular dispositional elements of like, are these the thrill seeker types, which I'll tell you right now, my gut would say in the US that probably is the case. Also some folks who probably score fairly high on social dominance orientation in the United States would be my hypothesis. And so, so we're looking at doing something along those lines. Hopefully Mandy doesn't mind me talking too much about this, but like, it's exciting work. I'm really excited to work with my colleagues on that. And I believe Robert Airwood's actually going to collaborate with us on that too. So again, that's an example of the kinds of work I like to do. I really, really like the collaborative. I hate to say it, I'm probably a bad social psychologist, because social psychologists are really good about working by themselves, right? And turning out single author papers. And that's just not ever really been my style, because I can do that, but I really, really like when I get to work with incredibly brilliant people like yourself, Sarah, to do this kind of work. I'm here to learn. And I had a professor in grad school who once said, the greatest blessing in the world is to be in a room where everyone's smarter than you. And the greatest curse is when you're the smartest person in the room.
Always try and be in a room where you're the dumbest person in the room. It's
Literally.
the best. It's the best thing when you're not the smartest person in the room, because then you get to learn so much.
Exactly.
And it is one of the reasons that my academic CV looks so strange.
Mine
It's,
too.
I've gone from, I've done work, from music psychology to the psychology of religion to autism research to social identity stuff. So, but it's all in this idea of just, I want to not know more than the people who are around me, so they can teach me so much more, and I can be a better person for it. And
Yeah.
I think you and I share that desire.
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah. It's probably why we get along so well.
Yeah. And we are both the kind of person to also think that the other person is smarter than we are. Like, so
Yes,
you probably think
so
I'm
true.
smarter than you are. And I definitely feel like you're brilliant. So it's a wonderful thing to finally be able to have this long drawn out conversation with you. I managed to twist your arm a bit, because ever since I first interacted with you in 2019, I managed to get that hint that you were this clearly very, very knowledgeable, brilliant person. And so it's been really, really lovely to have some time with you to ask you about, firstly, your research, talking about the cross-cultural relevance, but also I would like to know not just the stuff that you're planning on doing in Wrexham, but as well as that, the work that you've been doing on religiosity across the lifespan, like that because that stuff's a bit more recent, so I haven't managed to read much about that stuff yet. Like, so what's that work that you're doing in terms of religiosity across the lifespan?
This is some stuff that I'm doing with Heinz Tribe, Job Chin, Barbara Keller, Ralph Hood, Will Andrews, Ramon Bullock, and I know I'm at least forgetting probably 4 or 5 other people. We've had this massive research team. A number of years ago, multiple years, we've been awarded multiple Templeton grants to study this. And I have to really give a shout out to Heinz because he was incredibly brilliant about starting to realize, I want to say maybe 12 or 13 years into our continued collaboration, that we ought to be really, it's funny when you do Fowler's kind of stuff, right? Fowler's built on this idea of faith change, right? And very much Fowler believed it in a more hierarchical kind of developmental sense. Heinz has taken a more stylistic approach, which I think is incredibly useful. But but the fact is that still baked at its foundation is this idea of this developmental model, right? Even though we, in some ways, we tease into it a little bit in our writing and then back up and go, but it's still styles, right? So, there's a lot of shifts in how people see their worldview and how they structure their knowledge of their beliefs and how they see others, right? So once we got IRB approval, we started going back and finding some of the original participants from some of our earlier works, both in deconversion and spirituality, and then started creating these time points of collecting data and seeing, like, basically reconducting faith development interviews with those folks, doing a battery of quantitative measures, everything from the Big Five to Carol Riff's psychological well-being scale, Hood's mysticism scale, etc. And what's fascinating too is, and actually I'll go a little bit off of the writing here, it's something I've noticed over the years because I find it fascinating, is how much world events really influence some of these things, right? And how, you think through the cognitive lens of how people reframe their life experience through their current mind, right? And it's really, really fascinating to see people that you interviewed 5-10 years ago and the kinds of things and the values and the beliefs they had in those early days, and then how some of those continue to stay like almost like a stream of thought through their life. But then new priorities emerge and new life events, like, good things like people get married or they have kids, or bad things, someone gets a divorce or they've lost a loved one, and how, and that's just at the individual level. And then you also think about the changing world, right? The changing political landscape, COVID-19, all these events that really deeply impact people. They absolutely provide additional context for how you frame your faith and your beliefs or lack thereof. And you find some folks that, of course, double down on their belief system. They really hyper focus in on their beliefs as these events happen. You find some folks that, like they're kind of like cumulative heretics that kind of just constantly change faith over and over. A life event happens and they completely change their identity and they go, I'm probably guilty of that myself. And so, and then you get a variety of other things, like where you see families convert, for example, not just an individual, but the whole family converts to a new faith and they kind of go in together versus the sort of individual, the cognitive dissonance that may come at the individual level. And they start sort of really disconnecting from those belief systems because maybe they see moral transgressions occur in their faith tradition, or there's some particular sort of moral norm that gets violated and swept under the rug, or they just theologically start disagreeing with what their beliefs are. And so I think the real strength of Strive, Hood, and Keller's work that I've gotten to collaborate with for the years, I think the real strength of it is just the depth of methodological rigor that they brought to the table. I mean, Heinz and Barbara and Ralph, all three really, really carefully thought through, like, what are the data points? So, like, in other words, on the quantitative side, what are the variables that we potentially should be looking at? But on the qualitative side, what are the data elements that are definitely great? And anybody who knows me knows this. I sometimes have struggled a bit with faith development as a theory, even though I've literally been doing this work. I have to say, the late Jim Fowler, his faith development interview is still one of the best interview protocols I've seen. And I'm a qualitative researcher too, because I do both. And his faith development interview is still just stellar. It's stellar. So even if you're not necessarily coding using sort of the Strive and Keller approach, or even Fowler's coding approach, the interview protocol is amazing. It can really inspire other really cool qualitative measures if you ever need it. So, I encourage the listeners to check out the manual for faith development, which is free, by the way, out on the internet. So it doesn't matter where you are, you can get it. And it's got the interview protocol in there. It's also got the coding scheme that Strive and Keller have provided. So it's really, really, it's a really great measure. And I've really fallen in love with it over the years. So
I am a big fan of any free resources, open
Oh, me
access and
too.
open source resources. Having spent some time, as I mentioned before, in the autism research world, that stuff is highly proprietary. A lot of the
Yeah.
autism research items and the questionnaires and all of that stuff. Something that I've been a long proponent of, as you're probably well aware, is openness in research. And so
Yep.
big fan of anything that has the tools with which people can conduct science without having to lay out huge sums of money. So I will, in the YouTube version of this podcast, I will have in the description of the episode a link to that, so that way people can just access it.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's wonderful. And you're right about the paywall problem. Like even like when I've done personality research, like with the big five, the NEO-FFI is expensive, and there's so many other really good measures out there that are highly validated. And then they put them behind a paywall. And if you're again in sort of the global north here, $10 in administration to you it's money, but it may not be that much money to you. But if you're in a country where $10 is a lot of money, that means that our colleagues in those countries don't have access to do the science that we take for granted, right? And so I really, really believe like we need to be creating opportunities and ways where we can make those resources available to all of us to be able to do good science. So
yes, this is actually something, the first time you and I spoke, this is exactly the topic that we spoke about when you
it is. Yeah, it is.
You had your own podcast and you are interviewing me about open science and my work in the open science community and what I described as instead the open research community, because I prefer to not only include science research but also sociological work and history, and I think everyone is able to do open research, and part of that is having open access to the scientific tools with which we can do good science. And I strongly recall talking about my distaste for a specific piece of statistical software that is often used in psychology. I will not name names right now, but it's they charge an arm and a leg to universities and or individuals when free options are available. Right. But the free options are definitely a little bit more clunky initially, but once you get the hang of it, they're actually a lot, in my opinion, a lot better. But there is this unfortunate deviation away from what I told you about the Mertonian norms that were spoken about in the 1940s. We're talking about the communalism, the kind of the universality, the organized skepticism, all of that stuff that science claims to have. But when it comes to opening up the tools, as you mentioned, Big Five, there's a lot of stuff in many areas of research that just doesn't do it. It hides things behind paywalls, and I'm glad that the science is slowly shifting away from that.
Yes.
With open access articles, with data, data repositories, all of that stuff. But it is a slow move, and it's a paradigm shift, and paradigm shifts are not always instantaneous. They do take a generation. One of my favorite quotes that is paraphrased, attributed to Max Planck, I'm not entirely sure it is Max Planck related, but science advances one funeral at a time, is effectively the paraphrase version of what he said.
Yeah, I like that.
And that's how paradigm shifts, like a leaning towards openness, are able to occur over the course of a generation of scientists, because the open science collaboration and the open science movement started in the early 2010s. We're now in the mid 2020s. And we've definitely seen a huge shift since 2012 when a lot of this stuff came to light. A huge shift since early 2010, 2012. But we're not there yet, in my opinion.
Right. No, agreed. In fact, the theory I always think of when it comes to this too is like Everett Rogers' diffusion of innovation, right? And I hate to say it, I'm going to say something that's a little controversial, so everybody still love me when you see me again. I think sometimes we get a little dogmatic as researchers. I've seen colleagues of mine that I love and adore be very dogmatic about, like, particularly in social psychology. I remember when, like, I would talk about, well, I'm also a qualitative researcher. And it was almost like they wanted to pat me on the head and be like, well, that's so cute. But we do experimental research. And again, I know where they're coming from because they want the rigor, and I get it, so it is not dissing them in any way. But then I remember, I think it was 2019, maybe, when I went to SPSP, all of a sudden, the vendors, like Max QDA and Vivo showed up, and I'm like, oh, So there, and that's what I always look at. I always look at what's being sold at these conferences in the vendor room, because that always tells me where things are going. Because if they're going to pay the money to set up a table, that means they see the trends going this way. They've done their research, right? And so it was funny going through my PhD in social. I remember in the beginning, everybody was like, well, we're not really counting your qualitative research. And I was like, okay, I'll deal with it. Right. And then by the end of my PhD, all of a sudden, there were a number of social psychologists who were like, well, I'm now dabbling in mixed methods as a form of validation for some of the quantitative stuff I'm doing. And I was like, oh, really? So it was like, I mean, I'm a simple guy, but I did feel kind of like I was ahead of the curve on that one, right? Like I was an early adopter in the Everett Rogers model. But I see Rogers' model play out in science, not just in industry. And so that's why I really like what you're saying about this area. It's like, sometimes the laggards are the real hard ones to kind of push to, and I'm using Rogers terms here. The laggards are always the ones that are the ones that we're really trying to push to consider these new approaches. But I can also give credit. I've also known a few of our older colleagues over the years who will embrace new ways of doing things. I got to give a shout out to Ralph. Ralph's really good about that. Ralph's always, he is old guard. I mean, he is the definition of old guard. And one of the things I love about Ralph is he was always willing to consider new ideas and new approaches. And so we do still see it, we still see it. And I think in psychoreligion particularly, I think our folks, I'm gonna give a shout out to all of our colleagues here so nobody hits me for the other thing I said. But I think in psychoreligion, our colleagues are probably a lot more open-minded in the social sciences than some of the other fields. I've seen this particularly in sort of some of the personality and some of the identity stuff in social that, probably a little less open-minded than I'd like them to be. Not to say everybody's that way, but so that is one thing that is nice, I think, about all of our colleagues, right?
I agree. And I'd like to point out Jordan LeBeouf and Kevin Ladd
Jordan's
in
great.
particular.
Jordan's great.
Kevin in 2019, so I went to my first IAPR conference in 2019 in Gdansk in Poland. And there I was, 2 years into my PhD, not even 2 full years into my PhD. Mm-hmm. And I was presenting on some of the research that I was doing throughout my PhD. And I was talking about how I'd pre-registered a lot of the studies and talking about how, the data mm-hmm. was going to be available on repositories. And Kevin was sitting down and he was taking notes. And then I sat down with him and I was like, why isn't this discussed more in IAPR? And he's like, I don't know why it's not. And then, a couple of years later, he's also old guard. He's a professor. He's a, full-on professor of psychology and psychology of religion. So he's been around the block. He's done fantastic work across the years. But he straight away, he was on it. And he was like, actually, why aren't we doing this? And he is one of the reasons, in my opinion, as well as like Mikhail Van Elk and Jordan LeBeouf and people like that, who are part of the reason that I think the psychology of religion and the cognitive science of religion and these areas are really at the forefront of the open research kind of paradigm shift.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, Jordan, Adam. I mean, there's a lot of our colleagues who just are doing freaking great work. I mean, really, Kathy, Chris. I can go down the list. I got my list of 15 heroes, and fortunately, I happen to know them, which is great. They're all doing really, really awesome work, and a lot of the empirical stuff that they're doing is freaking fascinating. And I sometimes wish I had the chops for that myself, but I read their stuff really, with just enthusiasm and excitement. And so, I think we're very lucky because in some ways, the IAPR and psychology of religion in general provides this wonderful nexus where we get to come together and really, really deconstruct the things we're doing in a really productive way. And, I think while sometimes it's great to go to specialty conferences, I think sometimes the innovation and the novelty comes out of working with and talking to a lot of people who are doing stuff that's just light years outside of the things you do. I can't tell you how many just really cool ideas I've had, like having conversations with people like yourself, Sarah, just sitting around and I hate to say it, having a beer or a coffee or, and just talking, I mean, the papers are amazing at IAPR. They really are. But it's the side conversations that are just, I actually don't think, every time I go to IAPR, I probably get maybe 5 hours of sleep a night because I'm just having so much fun having these conversations at night and building connections.
It is the intangible aspect of going to a conference that you forget to take into account. Like, you're always thinking about, okay, oh, this talk is about to happen, or I'm really interested in this piece of research, this paper that's going to be presented, this keynote speech. And then you realize, as you mentioned, that some of the best conversations that I had were, at the social evening, or they one of my colleagues who I adore, Noah, who's in Amsterdam.
Yeah, Noah is awesome.
We went out at the last conference, and we went to a drag show, afterwards, and we were having a beer at a drag show. And while that was happening, we were discussing stuff, and we were talking about, and some of the best conversations end up when you're just in that kind of environment, because it just happens, because people who are interested in like-minded things, and when you're not feeling stuffy, when you're not feeling like you have to perform, and it's just casual, suddenly
yes
the interesting conversations fall out of it, and suddenly you're not feeling like you have to present yourself in a specific way, and because of that, suddenly you feel, I guess, more open to being shown new ideas, or whatever it is. You're just relaxed, and suddenly it's like, okay, well, yeah, why hadn't I considered that way before? That kind of thing.
Yeah, and actually, I'll say something else too. And Noah's a great example of this. So, what's really great about Noah, you can talk to him, and he will, if you don't know something, he doesn't assume you're ignorant or something. He'll be like, oh, well, let me tell you about this, and he'll give you the background, literally the executive summary of the literature, and be like, and so you should check this out when you get home. It's so nice to be with people like that, where you can actually be vulnerable a little bit about what you don't know. I think the problem with us being, especially for us professors, right? I think sometimes we feel like we always have to be the expert on the thing, right? But what's nice about those side conversations a lot of times is you can be a little vulnerable and go, I haven't read this stuff. I don't know what it. Tell me more about it. And then you go do this huge deep dive into the literature when you get back from the conference, because you got so fascinated by the idea, right? So, and I'm really thankful. I'm really glad you sort of say that, sir, because I'm really thankful when I get to have those kinds of interactions. So.
Yeah, and I know we've been speaking for a while, so I do want to not take up too much more of your time, but I know that you and I had a conversation back at the IAPR 2025, talking about how great it was seeing more researchers from Brazil, from Turkey,
yes,
and from various parts of the world that are not traditionally, had not traditionally been taking part in IAPR. We always had people from North America, we always had people from Europe, but it's really nice to see people from non-global North countries taking part. And I know that we were discussing how you wanted to see even more of that, and the IAPR to push even more to get people from parts of Asia, parts of Africa, other parts of South America, beyond Brazil. Even though Brazil, having Brazil there is great, but having the Spanish part of South America are also involved, not just the Portuguese, the Brazilian Portuguese, and so part of the goal, I believe, of the current president of the IPR is to do that, is to branch out, to ensure that we are not a weird institution, and that we are we are an international association, not a kind of transatlantic association, or whatever it is you want to call it, where it's just Europe and America. We want it to be everywhere, and researchers, we have SPRANs now, the researchers from Australia and New Zealand, but also I'd love to understand people who studied the Maoris. If you're looking at research in New Zealand, I'd love to understand psychology of religion in Maori context, or looking at if you're looking at, let's say, for example, in Thailand, or in Southeast Asia, or in not just China, but also in India, across different parts of India, because obviously India has got a specific religious majority, but does that change between North India and South India? And then you've also got differences across the whole Indian subcontinent, when you've got, as you mentioned, Pakistan earlier, the work's going on there, but there's also, does Pakistan and Bangladesh, even though they both have the same religion in terms of being Muslim majority countries, they are either side of India. So does that difference really show in cross-cultural comparisons within the Indian subcontinent? All of this stuff would be fantastic work if there were people from those areas doing research, and it would be great if we could find them. And if there's not,
Yes.
if we can try and encourage people to do that work, and preferably find researchers who are in that area from that area so that they know the culturally appropriate contexts and approaches to take.
No, 100%. I would love, there's nothing I would love more than for us to have a really decent representation from these areas at the next meeting, presenting on their work, even if it's religion adjacent. I think because, again, it's always those conversations that we have with those colleagues, and what are their hot buttons, like, and I mean by hot buttons, like interests, like what are their big things they're really, really interested in, and learn from them, like what are they reading, like what are the theories that are really meaningful to them. And so I think IPR, given our leadership is incredible, our organization's incredible. Of all the organizations I'm in, like I said, I really feel like IPR's really got it. They've really got it. I'm lost for words for once in my life, but it's really great. And so I think what would be amazing is for us to increase that representation. If one of our big funders out there would like to sponsor some of these folks, I would love to see that happen, right? I would love to see us invite and bring to the conference some of these folks. And then I think about the bridge building that we could do for us in the global north. I think we potentially could even set up collaborations where we even might potentially could go after funding to help them, right? Do the research that they're doing, and we learn from them. And again, I'm always really fortunate. Like when I travel and I travel internationally, one of the things I love to do is to sort of seek out professors in some of these places and invite them out for coffee. And I don't know them they don't know me, I don't know them, and I'll try to go have coffee with them and just learn what do they do. Try, even if they're even somewhat related to the stuff I do. I always love to do that, and I would love to see that happen in the IAPR space even more than it already has. And we do bring some folks in, and we do have some colleagues who are working to find funding to bring in these colleagues from these countries. But I would love to see it on even bigger scale. I think we would be better for it.
I think that's partly is your pedagogy brain kicking in, being like, it's just we can learn from other people as well.
Absolutely.
As the more people that you bring in, the more we can learn as a community.
Yeah. And I mean, one thing I'll say that the listeners who, if you weren't at IAPR, if you go, you see this, but it was really, really salient at the meeting in August, is the world's kind of in chaos right now. And yet we were all in a room together. We all were friends. We all had the same goal. We had science that bring us together, asking big questions and answering them. And there was something, it was moving. Actually, I'm getting a little emotional about it, but it was moving that all of us from all these different backgrounds, some from countries that were in conflict with each other, and we were all in this space together, and we were all friends, and we were all working together for a common goal, and we were learning from each other. I mean, y'all, it's a profound experience to have that, especially when we have our General Assembly. Like, it's just so incredible. We're all in this room together. And if you're a listener and you've not ever been to an APR meeting, it's worth it for that. And that's on top of all the conversations and amazing papers that we see. So I would invite folks to really consider going to Brazil. I'm going to be there. So.
And fingers crossed, so will I.
Yeah.
So, like I said, don't want to take up too much more of your time. So I had a few more questions I want to ask you, but I think I've talked your ear off more than enough, and our listeners,
no problem.
I think over an hour is probably more than enough for our listeners. So,
sorry, y'all.
No, that's on me as well. So I will just ask you one final question, which is there anything that you did want to say that you think hasn't been covered in the questions that I've asked you?
What's also nice too, I know we've really been focusing on this sort of international collaboration piece, but one thing too, if you look at a lot of the big grant funders and their calls for proposals, we're seeing there's two big things I'm starting to see more and more. One is we're seeing a lot more multidisciplinary research. So collaborating with our colleagues in sociology, religious studies, anthropology, medicine, neuroscience, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing we are starting to see is a lot more willingness to fund international research. And I think that's, I think it's so, I think both of those things are just great opportunities for learning. So besides, of course, everyone wants a grant, it looks good on your resume, it's great to help science. But I think there's a lot of personal and professional growth that comes out of those experiences too. It definitely has been for me. And again, I want to thank the leadership of IAPR. They've done a really incredible job. I want to thank my colleagues who come to IAPR and enrich my life every time I go. And I'm incredibly appreciative to everybody. And so, please, if you're at the next meeting, come say hi to me. I'd love to meet you. And, I'm looking forward to where science goes from here. I mean, there's such good stuff happening right now. I'm in the audience watching and somewhat participating. So.
And I do just want to reassure the listeners that we do not have a gun to your head. We're not just asking you to say nice things about the IAPR just because you're on our podcast.
No. This is my opinion, 100%.
Pure, unprompted. Because you said that, I do have one more question because that's the nature of how my brain works. But
sure.
You talked about looking at international and multidisciplinary things being funded. But so if you could design a multidisciplinary research program in an area that you're interested in specifically, and you had no constraints, you had no monetary constraints, and you had no, like, in theory, like, borders didn't exist, you could just go to places, make things happen, what would the central aims, like, what would be a research question that you think that you would really want to tackle if you had this multidisciplinary and international research available to you with no constraints?
No constraints. I actually would like to better understand. This is fuzzy, so because you put me on the spot, but I think I'd really like to really further explore the interconnection between religion and culture in a bit more detail. So, for example, in democratic societies, generally we separate religion and culture to some degree, even though there's still a little bit of overlap. But in some societies, right, for example, in the Middle East, religion and culture are kind of very much intertwined. So one of the things I'd really like to understand better is sort of the cognitive schema around how one sees their religion and their culture within their particular context. And what this is tied into is actually spirituality, because I always sometimes wrestle with spirituality really a quote unquote Western construct, and that have our colleagues in other parts of the world adopted the term because it's appeared in the science, not necessarily because it's actually a construct that's occurring in those local contexts. And I'll give a case example. As I was talking to a colleague in India who'd mentioned to me that, well, spirituality for folks that live out in rural areas, spirituality, the term has a different connotation than what we mean. They were arguing that, like, spirituality means dealing with spirits, which is kind of like dark magic kind of stuff. So when someone talks about spirituality, there's a bit of a visceral reaction, negative visceral reaction that comes from that. And that really resonated with me, because and again, I know it's a bit anecdotal, but I was kind of like, wow, and we've got a number of colleagues doing research on spirituality all around the world. And I'm always wondering, like, have we in the West sort of forced this concept onto another context because of, we're doing science and that kind of thing, but was it inherently something that is a human experience, or is it a Western semantics of a particular experience, right? So again, it's a fuzzy idea, but that might be something that I would do probably a fairly mixed methods design on, where we would want to explore and parse out that religion culture interaction to better understand, are there experiences that are unique and special, that are universal, right? The common core thesis, for example, right, that are universal, or are they culturally determined, right? Which would be fascinating.
That's a brilliant answer. And I have to admit, when I was growing up, as someone from a Jewish background in a Christian country, but a secular Christian country, like technically the church has we have an official church, official religion, but in the UK, I grew up in North London, which is quite a Jewish majority area, but there's also a lot of Muslims in the area. And so when I heard the term spirituality, I always associated that with paganism, or like some form of non-religious belief, but in a belief in a superpower of some kind. What I have come to call in my academic framing super empirical beliefs, but a non-religious super empirical belief is how I always have thought about spirituality. Things like ghosts, things like magic, that kind of thing.
Right.
And so I can see how someone, the anecdote that you mentioned, how that visceral reaction that they got from hearing spirituality and thinking like black magic or something like that, because it's not religion. Spirituality is this other thing. And so I can
Right.
see how that comes through. And I think you're right. I think in the West, especially in the last 20 to 30 years, we have started using the term spirituality more and more to kind of have this ephemeral, just kind of religious-y thing, but not quite religious. Whereas that may not be the way that people understand it elsewhere.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then, and then there's also, not to get too religious studies based, but there's also performative religion, which it can be very ritualistic based, that may not always, that's done out of tradition, but not necessarily out of eliciting an ecstatic experience of the individual. It's just done for tradition. So, there's sometimes, I think, these layers that we really have to be mindful of that may or may not be, yeah.
So, and on that note, funders, if you're listening, or researchers in other parts of the world, if you're listening, if you could provide constraintless or at least lowered constraints on Chris's work, that would be great, because I think this would be a very fruitful avenue of research. So thank you so much for your time, Chris. And thank you, listeners, for listening to this slightly longer version of the podcast. Chris and I both have this habit of continuing conversations on when we're talking to one another in particular.
Yes.
So thank you for bearing with us. And I hope you, Chris, have a lovely day. For me, it's an evening, but for you, it's in the daytime. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and have a lovely weekend.